In this video, we're going to talk about one other type of source that you might consider using for your comparative review assignments, and those are primary sources. You may have heard the terms primary and secondary research in science courses or maybe in some gen eds you've taken in the past, but usually when we use the terms primary and secondary in the context of policy studies or history or similar disciplines, they have a different meaning than they do in the sciences. So if you've heard those terms before, try to set aside your understanding for now, and we're going to define what we mean by primary and secondary sources specific to policy studies and this assignment. So when we're talking about policy studies, primary sources are things like records or documents that are created in the ordinary course of business of an individual or an organization. So that means that as any business, any legislative body, any person goes about their day-to-day business, they're usually creating a documentary record. And it might be explicitly part of their job to create records of what they're doing. But it also might be a little bit more incidental, like you would create records of, purchases that you made or emails that you sent, for example. So we all create these primary sources. These can be really valuable for research because of the fact that they're created at the time of an event under study, they really reflect what people were thinking about as they made decisions. And how those decisions were made and what were the key events that were discussed at the time. So they provide a certain type of insight that you might not get from other types of sources into the life of an individual or the work of a particular committee or body. So they're very valuable for research, but one of the things to consider is that unless they're systematically collected, they can be difficult to find. So often, for individuals, you might only find them in an archive somewhere. We're lucky, though, because we're looking at policy studies. Governments are actually pretty good at systematically collecting primary sources. So there are quite a few places where you can go to look for those. And I'll give you some examples a bit later in the video. So let's contrast that with secondary sources. These are the sources that you're very familiar with. So think about, books and articles that you commonly use for your assignments. Those are secondary sources. So kind of thinking about their nature, they're documents or papers or research that analyze or describe an event, topic, or person, usually after the event. So once something has occurred, once decisions have been made, often it's done by experts. They'll come and they'll look at multiple sources, they'll put them together, and they'll provide their analysis in the form of a book or an article. These are really helpful because they provide a much broader perspective than primary sources do. Primary sources are extremely narrow and will tell you what's going on at the time, but they don't really provide you with the broader context of what's going on. And secondary sources also often have the benefit of hindsight. They can look back and make judgments about the decisions that were made or actions that people took. So they both have their benefits, but for your assignments, you will primarily be using secondary sources, right? Books and articles. So keep that in mind as we go forward. One other thing I want to talk about on this is our newspapers. So there's lots of discussion about whether newspapers are primary or secondary sources. And my interpretation would be that it really depends on the context of the article you're looking at. So for example, a news article that's reporting on, legislative decisions or events that are occurring, at that time period, those would often, in my mind, would be considered primary sources because they're products of the events that are unfolding at the time. But sometimes newspaper articles will also, provide that sort of analysis and hindsight that secondary sources do. They'll look back at an issue and summarize an issue. And in those cases, I would consider a newspaper article to be a secondary source. So really, it depends on the nature of the article and what kind of information you're pulling from that article in order to decide if that's a primary or secondary source. Let's just look at a couple of examples really quickly. So just, let's step aside from policy studies and think about your own life. So what primary sources might exist about you? There are tons. Every day of your life, you create lots of primary sources that somebody could down the road eventually use to study your life. So that could include things like photos you've taken with your phone, emails, your social media, your medical records, if you keep a calendar, even your search history, God forbid. There are a number of different pieces of information that a person could go back and collect about you to understand you. So what about secondary sources? Well, unless you have a biography written about you, there may not be very many direct secondary sources about you, but secondary sources can also include sources that describe the context of your life, right? So there might be sources about our current political and social times, right? Or about, the time period in which you live. There are lots of different ways of getting at that. But really, secondary sources is just kind of describing a broader context. So, the time that you're living in, the place that you're living in. Let's look at a more specific example to your assignments. So if you're looking at pharmacare, broadband, or video game industry policy, what types of primary sources could you use? There's really an endless list, and these are just a few examples. You could look at relevant acts and regulations. So that can be within Canada, or it can be within your comparative countries or places. You could look at, debates in the House of Commons. So how is the topic of the day discussed? You could look at committee reports. So some of those reports we talked about in a previous video, some of those could be considered primary sources because they're created by committees in the ordinary course of their business, right? So you might consider some of those primary sources. Transcripts, resolutions of intergovernmental bodies like the UN, for example, press releases. It really is endless, but it's those documents that are created just in the ordinary course of business. And then secondary sources, I think that's a little bit more clear. So, any books or articles that look into policy considerations, but also thinking more broadly about, social, economic, and political aspects that surround the issue you're exploring. So those are primary and secondary sources. Again, for your assignments, you're really predominantly using secondary sources. You're going to be using those books and articles. You'll probably dive into some of the research reports, but I would strongly encourage you to at least dip your toes into some primary sources for this. Start experimenting with them and seeing how you can use them. On that note, I do want to say that be really cautious about going on fishing expeditions for primary sources. So some of the places I'm going to show you where you can find them are huge. They're absolutely massive. And if you, start going on a fishing expedition, you'll end up in the middle of the lake and we'll never see you again. What you want to do is start with your secondary sources, read through your books and articles, and look for references to primary sources or to dates or to people that you might then use to go find appropriate primary sources. So, for example, you might find references to particular legislation, and then you can go and look up that legislation and see what it says firsthand. You might find references to particular dates that a bill was discussed in the House of Commons, and then you might go find out, look at the transcripts of the debates on that day and find out what the discussion was all about. So there are ways of getting at primary sources, but one of the worst ways to do it is just to go into some of these places and just start fishing around and hoping you find something. So we're going to go to the library and take a look at the policy studies guide that you've seen before. On that guide, there are a number of examples of primary sources that you can take a look at. So I'll just navigate to the guide here. So the page we're going to look at is called Policy and Government Documents. You've seen this before. On this page, though, there are a number of links to mostly Canadian federal sources of primary documents, parliamentary and other types of documents that are available. Again, I'm going to focus on Canadian examples, but you can find very similar examples from other countries by exploring, their federal websites. So I'll just show you a couple of examples from this page. One I want to look at first is Des Libris. This is a library database, so you'll be asked to sign in. This contains a wide range of documents, mostly from the federal government and departments and agencies of the federal government. This runs the gamut from, brochures that are distributed to promote certain services, all the way up to, in detailed research reports. So you'll find a little bit of everything in here. So you can just do a very broad search in here for your topic and see what you come up with. Again, It's going to be a wide range of things. Try to focus, for this assignment, you'll want to focus mostly on research reports and similar things, and less so on the more the advertising and things like that is less relevant to what you're looking at. But you can find some good information about the findings of particular agencies or departments as they go about their business. So that's Des Libris. I'll go back to this page and I'll show you a couple more examples. One that I think you should all be familiar with is the Justice Laws website. So this is a website used by the federal government to consolidate legislation, so consolidate acts and regulations that have been passed by Parliament. And I'll just walk you through a couple of features on this website. I'll leave it to you to explore it a little bit more. Here you can find constitutional documents. So if you're looking at anything to do with, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, for example, you can come here and find that. But more importantly, I want to highlight the consolidated acts and regulations. So as you know, when a bill is presented, it's debated and discussed, and eventually it may become an act. And often some of these bills are just amending existing acts. So every once in a while, they consolidate all of these changes to the acts and present sort of the most up-to-date version. And so that's what you'll find under this link. You'll find the most up-to-date version based on any modifications that have been made over the years to the act. And so if you're doing some research and you find reference to particular pieces of legislation, this is a really good place to go. Again, it's helpful if you know the name of the legislation that you're looking for here, and you can find it down here. The other thing you might want to take a look at are consolidated regulations. So just so you're aware, acts often have regulations associated with them. So those are the nitty-gritty details that go into enforcing an act. So for example, if you're looking at health and safety related acts, so you have the legislation, the act itself, that sets the terms of the law around that topic. But there may also be regulations associated with that. So that might define things like, like food and drug regulations and health and safety regulations around a wide variety of topics. So again, the nitty-gritty details about those, but those are often very helpful for finding out how particular acts and legislation is implemented in Canada. So the regulations are really useful as well. So do take a look at those. So just moving back here, I'll show you a related website, another way of getting at this information. And this is Policies, Regulations, Laws by Department or Agency. So this is helpful if you've identified a particular department that's affiliated with your topic. So Health Canada, for example, might be one. And so you can look here and there will be a list of legislation that is governed by or is enforced by that department. So let's just look at Health Canada as an example. If we do a couple of clicks here under Acts and Regulations, you'll see a list of all of the acts and regulations that are the responsibility of Health Canada. So you can imagine with a department that size, there's quite a few here, and you can see there are quite a few. But it's a good way to identify some of those acts and regulations that you might not otherwise have identified through the literature. So you can come and get the original legislation that way. Just a couple of other sources I'll show you. Another one that you really should be familiar with is Legisinfo. Legisinfo provides information about all of the bills that have been put before Parliament. And it goes back to about 1994. So if you're ever curious about what a bill looked like when it was presented to Parliament and how it actually passed through Parliament, you can come here and take a look for some information. So let's just go to a historical date. We'll look at the 40th Parliament, third session, and it lists all of the bills that were put before that session, in order, of course, in numerical order. And you can see a bit of information right here. So, for example, the progress. So this one has, it was from 10 years ago. So it's received royal assent. So you can actually get more information about that bill. Let's just scroll down to one that has a lot of information about it. So you can get information about the bill. You can find information about, when first reading, second reading occurred, any committees that it went to, and that's a pretty common occurrence, right? It'll be sent to a committee for discussion and modification, and then of course as it passed its way through its Senate and perhaps gone to Senate committees as well. So there's a lot of information here about that. Of course, there are links to these standing committees that it would have gone to, and then you can follow up and find some more information about it there. Another nice feature about Legisinfo, you can look at previous published versions of the bill. So, for example, you can see what the bill looked like at first reading, and then as it was amended by committee. So you can really get a sense of the adjustments that were made over time to that particular bill. A nice additional feature that actually links to another resources I wanted to talk about is this, where you can look at major speeches at second reading. So this is where that particular bill would have been discussed in the House of Commons. And so let's just take a quick look here. I'll just click on this. This was actually presented by Jason Kenney. So you can see so this links out to what's often called the Hansard, or the debates of the House of Commons. So when the House of Commons meets, and as well as the Senate, this is available for the Senate as well, a verbatim transcript of the discussion that goes on in Parliament is kept and recorded and published on this website. And so you can access those going back, again, I think these go back to about 1994, although there are historical ones available elsewhere. And so you can actually see the exact words that members of Parliament used to discuss and debate a particular bill. So that's one way of getting at the debates. And I'll just show you, just so we're clear, I do have a link to the debates of the House of Commons right here. So you can get directly to the Hansard with that link, get back to this page. I'll just show you a couple of other features of this document or this source. So you can filter by date. So again, this is where you're reading through your secondary resources. They've mentioned particular dates that topics might have been discussed or were, in discussion broadly in the House of Commons or just in society. And you can kind of go to those dates. So you can navigate by date, select that particular date. And then you can actually filter. You can explore the content of this, because you can imagine these are quite large. You can explore the content of this in a couple of different ways. So you can look at the topics that were discussed on that day and select those topics, and then find references to those by the person who spoke, as well as the timestamp. So you can go down there and find out what the words of that particular person was. You can also explore these by members specifically. So if there's a particular member of Parliament that you're interested in, you can click on their name and find out the topics that they spoke about on that day. And then again, same kind of information. You can also get a little profile and some vote information about that person. So it's a very useful resource just for providing some evidence about what was said about your topic. So what were the debates about? And how did people argue for or against the particular issue that you're exploring? So this is a really rich resource. There are other types of documents on this website. I won't go to them in detail on the House Publications website, but you can explore other types of documents that are coming from the Parliament of Canada there. Just going back to this page quickly and to summarize, so I mentioned that you can get information about bills and the debates going back to, this is 2001, although I think that's been moved. I need to update that. But if you need information on bills or debates prior to the dates that you can find them in this link and this link, you can get them through Canadian Parliamentary Historical Resources, and that'll send you to the Library of Parliament website, where the historical debates and bills are kept. So you can do a very similar search in there. So those are just a few examples of primary resource collections that you can go to find additional information. Again, just to reiterate, for your comparative reviews, you should be relying primarily on secondary sources. So looking at those books and articles first, and then of course those research papers that we talked about. But do consider dipping your toes into some of these primary sources. They're helpful in just illustrating some of the finer details around your point or around your topic, and highlighting what the discussion was, the topics of the day, what people were talking about, how they were framed, and again, how the legislation specifically addresses the particular topic that you're looking at. So there are a lot of uses to these, but don't focus on them for your papers. Try to, if you identify some of them in the secondary literature, then you can then pursue primary resource in appropriate repository.